We have with us today Dr. Steve Levitt. Dr. Levitt is an economist at the University of Chicago and the co-author of Freakonomics and its sequels. He also is the founder of Risk, which houses Data Science for Everyone, which is an organization that advances the curricula and cause building more data science into K-12 schools and trying to infuse more math pathways with real data skills that are useful for the modern world. If you want to find out more about data science for everyone and their work, I just put a link into the chat. And that all spawned from a very popular podcast that Dr. Levitt did with his Freakonomics podcast, I believe in 2019, on making math more relevant in high schools and in K-12 schools more generally. So Dr. Levitt, welcome and thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you, Dash. Yeah, it's good to be here. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes and then open it up to questions. I'm always nervous when I talk about a subject that my audience knows more about than me, and you all know more about K-12 education and data science than I do. So let me just have a little bit of fun before we get into the deep stuff. Dash asked me to talk about how my motivation for getting into this data science stuff, and it starts way back when I was in high school, and actually my own math trajectory is kind of defined by when I went back for my 10-year reunion. My senior year calculus teacher was there. This guy was about 80-something years old, and I didn't think there's any chance he'd remember me. And I went up to him, didn't even say my name, just said hello. He looked at me confused, as I expected he would. And then he said, wait a second. He didn't know my name, but he said, wait a second. Didn't you get a 2 on the calculus AP exam? And I said, I did get a 2 on the calculus AP exam. So I went to a very elite high school. I was in honors calculus. He said, in the 25 years that I've been teaching honors calculus, you were the only student who has gotten a 2 in the history of my teaching. And that pretty much said a lot about my own experience with math. I was good enough at faking around, but I had this belief that math was just magic. I didn't understand that it actually represented the truth. It was just like a set of things that the teachers made up, and you memorized them and you regurgitated them. And as long as you could do that, you didn't need to understand anything. And that was completely my interaction with math. And then I went to Harvard as an undergrad, and I placed into a course that was called Math 1A. It was literally the lowest course that they offered in math, despite the fact that I had taken calculus. I literally had learned nothing. Proved that my 2 on the calculus AP exam was no fluke. And in Math 1A, I got to say, I showed up the first day of the first class I had, and I looked around the room. I said, how is it possible that other than me, every other male at Harvard is like 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighs like 215 pounds and is chiseled out of rock? Then I realized the only people who took Math 1A at Harvard was me, the hockey team, the football team. Like, it was the only people who went into Math 1A. So I dusted those guys. There's like 90% men. I got the highest grade in the class, and that was literally the last math class I ever took, because I had defined myself rightly as someone who wasn't a math person. Like everybody, I think almost every person at some point in their math career says, I'm not a math person, and checks out. And I had done that. I didn't know anything about going back. I got a PhD in economics. I had no idea that it was all about math, and I was incredibly unprepared. I'll just tell you the last story. So I showed up at the first day. I had worked for a few years. I had not taken a math class since Math 1A. And on the first day of class, the professor was scribbling, formulas on the board, and I was taking down notes. And lots of derivatives. In the economics, essentially all calculus. And the thing that was confusing me is that, sometimes there would be the regular D's, one on top of the other. And then sometimes there was this cursive D. I'm what the, I wrote it off as bad handwriting because I'd literally never seen a partial derivative in my entire life, because they didn't cover that in Math 1A. And about 50, and I looked at my notes, I just put DDD. I didn't make any difference. I didn't know the difference between partial and total derivative. And then about, 15 or 20 minutes in class, I just leaned over the guy next to me, and I said, wait, is there a difference between the straight D and the curly D? And he turned to me, and all he said was, you are in so much trouble. I was in so much trouble because every other person there had taken like linear algebra and everything, and I was just completely overmatched. But the thing was, look, math's not that hard if there's a purpose behind it and you know why you're trying to learn it and you actually have a problem in hand. So I learned it. Like I was not really good at it, but I certainly was profoundly better than I was back in the day, back in my 2 on the calculus AP days. And all of this kind of receded until I had 4 kids who went through high school math, and I was completely perplexed at how they could be doing the exact same math that I seem to have done 30 something years earlier. And they were worse than me in the sense that they just thought it was voodoo, and they had no idea what they were doing. They couldn't apply it. And just out of I had nothing to do I just decided to do a podcast, like Dash said, where I just kind of spouted off and didn't expect anyone to listen because no one really ever listens to what we say. But I just said, look, why don't we teach kids some math that they could possibly use at some point in their life? And I was amazed that in contrast to the complete void that usually follows our podcast, despite the fact that you had a lot of downloads, I was inundated. I mean, like absolutely inundated with people, and it struck a nerve, and there was a sense, and it also, there were maybe 10 or 15 different groups across the country that were working in isolation and data science. And the weirdest thing of all was that they reached out and they said, look, we're not making any progress. We need an organization at the middle, which, this didn't happen. Like usually it's a, dog eat dog world, and every little organization is fighting for the piece, but they said, we need someone in the middle. And so we got drafted essentially against our will to lead this data science for everything, for everyone group. And it's just been amazing. It's been interesting, such an interesting have we made any progress? Not too much, but we're trying hard. And there's a lot of big challenges, huge challenges. There's challenges around curriculum. There's challenges around teacher training. Maybe it's probably the biggest challenge that most of you went through the same incredibly bad training that I got, in terms of data science. And I only learned it, essentially the last thing I'll say is, the way I learned it was, I was like a degenerate horse player. I like to go to the racetrack. I was losing a lot of money. And when I was like 20, I thought, well, why don't, maybe I could build models that would help me. And so it inspired me to learn how to program, to go get data. I started analyzing data, and it was, it's what Dash said. There's some kids are interested in, you never know what a kid's going to be interested in, but if you can find the thing they're interested in, I think data science opens up a completely different relationship between the student and the material. And for me, it happened outside the classroom. In my own teaching, I've shifted away from teaching subject matter. I just teach data science, and I teach it in a very unusual way for university, and that I don't teach any tools and techniques. I just teach what I think is the art of it. I teach them about the importance of data cleaning, right? That's something that doesn't usually get taught, but the first problem set, I give them a data set that I've made dirty intentionally. I've added many errors to the data, just so their only exercise is to figure out, can they undo all the damage I've done to the data by doing the kinds of things that happen in data just by accident. And then we just essentially, I spent a lot of time talking about showing pictures and just talking about how do you interpret it, or what would you do next. And and I also like to teach really bad stuff. I like to show mistakes. I like to show people who confuse correlation and causality in published peer-reviewed journals, and let the students say, oh my God, wait, that's totally backwards. How could this have been published? Because I think we create this illusion that the gap between the teacher and the student is much greater than it really is, right? That the gap between a good student and a good teacher is really small. It's a little bit of experience, a little bit of training, but we, by always showing people the perfected thing, which is what we do in the university, you give students the illusion they're never going to be able to be producers of knowledge, that they're just consumers of knowledge. So anyway, I don't know, Dash, if that fills the bill. I don't want to spend all the time talking, but gives you a little sense of where I come from.
Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I think it really grounds us in how you got into this work and how you got passionate about infusing more data science into K-12 pathways. And also, I think you talked about something that probably everyone in this Zoom room has felt that what we're teaching is not always the most relevant, and how can we make it more relevant for what students care about right now and for what students have to do in college and in their careers. And before we open up to group questions, I have one somewhat selfish question. And I think, I have your book like right here, actually, on my bookshelf.
Good job planning around the bookshelf before the call. That's clever.
Yes, thank you so much. That actually, I promise that wasn't rehearsed. I, as a curriculum writer myself, and teachers are all curriculum writers too. We're given stuff, but we always modify and we make it our own. I think one of the things that is like really impactful for me about your work and your popular books is you ask such fascinating research questions that people often, especially economists, typically don't ask. And I think it leads to these fascinating data explorations and surprises. And that's something we try and build into our material in Skew The Script. I think that's something every teacher tries to do, is we want our students to feel like they're discovering things and discovering new and exciting things when they're using math and statistics. So I just want to ask, how do you come up with your research questions, and what's your process look like for exploring the data related to them?
Yeah, I just look around. I can't say I wish I could do something more profound, but I just, look, it really started because when I got to grad school, I was so overmatched that it was clear that I could never compete head to head with the students at MIT. And I really thought I was going to have get to be in, 4 years in grad school, then I was going to have to get a real job. And so I just said, look, as long as I have 4 years, I'm going to study whatever is interesting to me, which is not what almost every other grad student is doing. What every other grad student is doing is like very carefully surveying the literature and trying to figure out what little niche they can fit into that will, the market will like. But like, I didn't think the market was relevant to me. And so my approach was, well, what am I interested in? I thought, well, what do I watch on TV? And I watched the show Cops on TV. I love the show Cops. I said, well, if I love cops, I should be researching crime. And so that's what essentially, that was the brilliant, the brilliant logical path that took me into doing crime. And then I realized that the literature on crime was really bad, that there was a fundamental lack of understanding of correlation versus causality in the existing research, which had been done in the 1970s and hadn't been touched since. And then I just my approach is just to try to be observant, and not as much anymore. But then I just looked at everything in the world, and I was particularly interested in what we call natural experiments. So these are settings in which in economics you almost never do randomized experiments. So what you look for is quasi-experiments, cases where just by chance, nature or mistakes, human mistakes, lead to otherwise equal groups to be treated very differentially by some policy, which is essentially what a randomized experiment does, except in randomization, you really make sure it happens. But so, for instance, one of the early things I worked on related to crime and police. And so the question is, do police reduce crime or not? And if you just look at the correlation, say across cities, and look at how many police they have per capita and how much crime per capita, very positive, right? So that had led some very ill-trained criminologists, well, the entire community of criminologists in the 1970s were all ill-trained, to conclude that police cause crime rather than reducing crime. Of course, if you've ever been in a place that has a lot of crime, like the University of Chicago, where I live does, you know that when there's a lot of crime, the public policy response is to hire a lot of police. And so even if police are causally reducing crime, you can still find more police where there's more crime, right? If you live in a small town, I live in a relatively small town in Germany. I haven't really seen a police officer since I got here. They don't need one because there is no crime, right? So what I used as a kind of natural experiment were mayoral elections. So it turns out that in the year leading up to the mayor being reelected, almost every mayor wanted to prove they're tough on crime. And so across the country, you saw that there was a lot of police hiring in the year before mayor elections. And you might think of that other than the fact that that these police get hired, that there'd be no difference in crime in election years or not in election years. Not completely cut and dry, but that's the idea, that the election years had a lot of police hiring and didn't have any reasons that crime should be higher other than that. And so you could just look at what happens to crime in the election year, the year after, if there are more police. And it turned out that the crime went down in election years, and especially went down the year after elections, when there were more police on the police force. And it's kind of, the way you think about using data in a non-experimental setting to try to get at something that feels, it's not definitive in causality, but gets at it. And that's really just been I'd say the story of my life in data, is that I, when something puzzles me, when something interests me, I just, I file it away, and then I keep my eyes open. And often it's 3, 5, 7, 10 years in between the time a question hits me and the moment where I see a data set that will allow me to answer the question. And I have a lot of patience around it. And I just say, is it when I go to data, I think if I describe how I use data, my overriding theme in analyzing data is, at the beginning, the simpler the better. I will not, I can't make sense of anything other than what I call big bar, little bar graphs when I get into a project, right? So I just want to make a graph that has 2 bars, right? And it's the mean of some variable divided in some way. And 1 bar is really tall and 1 bar is really little. And I can understand that. But if I run any kind of regression or anything, I start to lose my intuition right away. And I like to really be as simple as possible and be as descriptive as possible. And when I've exhausted my ability to describe the data, only then do I really start to think about which way causality might run, or what kind of subtle things might be going on, or even what sort of biases might be in my data. I really try to, I go line by line. I go data, variable by variable. I just want to make sure I understand what's going on, because I don't know, I think it helps me avoid mistakes, and it also gives me some sense of what's really there and how to ask the right question. I think that often the right question is not the one that I started approaching the problem with.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that wonderful description. And I just put into the chat, we put in a natural experiment regression discontinuity in our AP Stats curriculum. We threw it in there for a 2-sample t-test without doing the more advanced regression stuff for determining if college has an actual causal impact on wages or if it's just correlational based on a study done at Yale, I think. So we have some of that too, but I think natural experiments open so many doors to so many great questions that you can answer without necessarily having to do an experiment. It's amazing that that's the background behind so much of your work. So I'd like to open up the floor for questions, and I'm going to do a method that I used when I was Zoom teaching at the height of the pandemic, and I'm going to have folks just rapid fire in the chat, type in any questions they have, and as you're putting stuff in the chat, I'll look through and pick out some to ask live. And I might call on you to ask live if you're comfortable. But while you're doing that, so go ahead and start typing things in the chat if you have any particular questions. There were some pre-submitted questions, and they were mostly in 2 different spheres. And one, maybe to start with, while people are putting separate questions in the chat, is in your experience, well, I'll frame it like this. AP Stats teachers are often the singletons in our schools. Like, we're the only stats teacher. And we know that data analysis is important, and we know that it's going to be important for students for basically any college major, and certainly for the workforce. And yet we still kind of feel like second-class citizens in our schools. How do we empower our voices to district leaders to say, hey, statistics and data science is important, and we should be building in more pathways, not sacrificing others, but building in more pathways that really involve data? How can we empower our voices to do that?
So that is the $1 million question. It's what we've been working with our Data Science for Everyone coalition on. I think, again, let me say, you all know more than I do, but here's my sense from a distance, is that we have an educational system which is 2 big problems. One is that I think while standards had the right intentions, what they've ended up doing is tying teachers' hands behind their back, because there's like a million things to cover and you have no time to do anything other than to, slam through as many as you can of the Common Core. And it's also created what I think is an illusion, is that math is a set of building blocks to get to calculus. Whereas, I mean, again, I've never taught any of these classes, but I just watched my kids take them. And it seems to me like my kids never remembered anything from the year before anyway, so it wasn't very helpful. And number two, it seemed like in calculus, they did all of pre-calc over in the calculus that my kids took anyway. And it seemed like you could learn all that in like 15 minutes. It was like super easy. Like, if I divide things more and more narrowly, eventually it kind of becomes like, I don't know. It seemed to me like there's this false view that you need to do a bunch of algebra and a bunch of geometry, and then even some more algebra before you can ever do calculus. And I think that is the biggest obstacle to statistics and data science being treated with respect, because because we haven't created the illusion that if you don't know data science and statistics, you can't do calculus along the way. And I think that's really what we're fighting against. And so I'm not anti-calculus in any way, shape, or form. I think calculus is fantastic. What I really am against is all of the view that you have to do all this stuff to get to calculus, which I really, I think my own view is it's an illusion. But okay, so what are we doing? We're trying to convince. Look, the colleges don't make it easier. The universities completely screw things up by saying, we're not going to look at applicants. Like, I don't know. I mean, we're trying to change it, but the other schools act like if you don't have calculus, then you can't apply to a, like a California school. And well, I mean, how stupid is that, right? So we're working with, but then when you talk to the people, you talk to the faculty, they're like, yeah, nobody actually thinks it's a good idea. It's just hysteresis. We're just stuck in this trap. And then there's all sorts of stuff I don't understand. Like we got this I truly don't understand. We convinced some universities to change their wording on their pages so that it would say, we don't require calculation, we value statistics and data science. I don't know what happened. Then they changed it back. I think somehow some of the hardcore like math nuts at the university, I mean, I really thought, who knows what it says on that page? Who takes the time to go and fight with and tell the president to turn back? But they did, which I mean, I'm shockingly ill-attuned to the politics of what's going on, but that was a real eye-opener that there exists some group, and it's some group of mathematicians who think that data science and statistics is so evil that they take real time out of their day to change wording on websites that, it's crazy.
Yeah, and we're pushing time here, but one other common question coming up in the chat is, as teachers, do you know any resources out there that we could turn to up our skills in more modern data science? There's a lot of trainings out there for, say, AP statistics, Algebra 1, Algebra 2, et cetera. But there's not a ton out there for more modern data skills, especially involving, say, statistical programming and whatnot.
Yeah.
Is there any, to your mind, that that we could turn to up our skills to more modern skill sets?
So let me say one thing. I know many of you probably have to go, but I can stay longer if that's not a problem. People want to stay on, I'm happy to talk, as long as people want. Dash, I don't know if that's okay with you, but if it's okay with you, it's okay with me.
Yeah, I think this will be our last question, so I'll respect everyone's time. But
okay,
yeah, so much.
Boy, there are a lot of resources out there, but there's one of the things we struggle with in data science is definitions, and like what is encompassed, what is modern data science. So I do believe that there's so we have a long list of resources at our DS3 website. I don't think we've broken them down very effectively into modern data science versus other things. It's a great question. I don't have a great answer, but tell you what, Dash, I'm going to talk to Zarek, who directly runs it, and Zarek can produce for you a list of that you can send out to people through email, so that the people have it. I think it's better than me trying to flail around and give a bad answer.
Amazing. Well, Dr. Levitt, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to make this recording available to everyone on our website, so folks who couldn't attend can watch it. And to the teachers who attended today, thank you so much for being here. I know some of you are on your conference periods. I know some of you is like right after school. It's like that de-stress time after that crazy 7th period class. I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. And I'll stick around too for a little bit, but I'll let everyone go. And Dr. Levitt, as long as you want to stick around, you can feel free to stick around. I'll end the recording now. But again, thank you all so much for being here. Those of you who were able to attend, I'll be sending out certificates of attendance for professional development hours as well.